A man stands at a wooden desk in a plantation office somewhere in the Mississippi Valley in the 1840s, dipping a pen into ink and writing numbers into a ledger. Rows of cotton yields, livestock values, land acreage, and then, in the same calm handwriting, the names of people. Next to each name is a dollar figure. A young woman is listed at $800, a man in his 20s at $1,200, a newborn child, only weeks old, already assigned a value that will grow as the child grows. Nothing in the ledger signals emotion. It reads like any other business record. Stay with this story, because by the end, you will see how American slavery was not only a brutal labor system, but a hidden financial architecture. One in which human lives became capital, mortgages, and balance sheets inside a rapidly expanding national economy. To understand that hidden structure, you have to begin with how American law defined slavery. In the slaveholding states of the 19th century, enslaved people were classified legally as chattel property. That classification meant they could be bought and sold, inherited through wills, seized for debt, or pledged as collateral for loans. Courts enforced those rights the same way they enforced ownership of land or livestock. On paper, enslaved people were assets. That legal definition shaped how plantation economies operated. Plantations were not simply agricultural operations. They were complex financial enterprises. Owners calculated the value of their estates not only by measuring acres or crop output, but by counting the number of enslaved people they controlled. Estate inventories prepared after a slaveholder's death often listed enslaved individuals alongside horses, tools, furniture, and land parcels, each with an assigned monetary value. The combined total represented the wealth of the estate. These valuations were not symbolic. They carried direct financial consequences. Banks and credit institutions increasingly accepted enslaved people as collateral for loans. A plantation owner seeking to purchase additional land or expand production could pledge enslaved laborers as security for borrowed money. If the loan went unpaid, those individuals could be seized and sold to satisfy the debt. This practice connected slavery to the broader financial system of the United States, linking plantations to regional banks, merchant credit networks, and international markets. By the early 19th century, this economic structure was being amplified by a single crop. Cotton transformed the scale of American slavery. After the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, cotton production expanded rapidly across the southern states. By the 1830s, cotton had become the dominant American export. British textile mills depended on it. Northern merchants transported it. International markets consumed it. The crop generated enormous wealth for plantation owners who could produce it efficiently. But cotton required labor, relentless, physically demanding labor, on a scale that only slavery could supply within that economic model. Plantations expanded across Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. Land speculation surged as investors purchased territories opened after the forced removal of Native American nations. As new cotton fields appeared, the demand for enslaved workers intensified. Planters needed laborers to clear forests, plant crops, harvest cotton, and maintain production cycles that fed global textile demand. This demand fueled a vast internal slave market. Professional traders built networks that moved enslaved people from older states in the Upper South, such as Virginia and Maryland, to the cotton frontier of the Deep South. Richmond, Alexandria, and Baltimore became major supply points. New Orleans and Natchez became some of the largest slave markets in North America. Traders organized auctions where buyers inspected men, women, and children before bidding on them as commodities. Between the late 18th century and the Civil War, historians estimate that more than 1 million enslaved people were forcibly relocated through this domestic trade. Movement occurred by land and by sea. Coffles of enslaved people were marched southward along long overland routes. Others were shipped along the Atlantic coast and through the Gulf of Mexico to plantation districts along the Mississippi River. Families were frequently separated in the process, as traders sold individuals based on labor demand rather than family ties. Inside plantation ledgers, these transactions appeared as entries in account books: a purchase here, a sale there, a transfer to another estate, a valuation adjusted according to age or skill. But the system contained another mechanism that expanded wealth even when no sale occurred. Under the legal doctrine known as partus sequitur ventrum, a child inherited the enslaved status of the mother. This meant that every child born to an enslaved woman automatically entered the system as property belonging to the same owner. Birth did not require a new transaction. The law itself produced the next generation of laborers. Plantation records reveal how closely this demographic growth was monitored. Overseers recorded births alongside crop production. Estate valuations often increased as children matured into laborers capable of working fields or performing domestic tasks. In purely financial terms, population growth meant expansion of assets. By 1860, the results were dramatic. The enslaved population of the United States had reached nearly 4 million people. The combined monetary value of enslaved individuals represented one of the largest concentrations of wealth in the country, greater in total value than many other categories of property. This reality helps explain why slavery proved so difficult to dismantle politically. It was not only an institution of labor or racial domination, it had become deeply embedded in the financial foundations of the American economy. Land, credit, export markets, and political power were intertwined with the ownership of enslaved people. What began as plantation labor had evolved into a system where human lives functioned simultaneously as workers, commodities, and capital. And the deeper that economic architecture grew, the more violently the nation would eventually collide with it. By the early decades of the 19th century, cotton was no longer just another agricultural commodity moving through American ports. It had become the central engine of the Southern economy and one of the most powerful forces shaping the global marketplace. What had once been a labor-intensive crop, processed slowly by hand, was transformed after 1793, when the cotton gin made it dramatically easier to separate cotton fibers from their seeds. The machine did not eliminate labor, it multiplied the scale of production that labor could support. Suddenly, vast new territories became economically viable for plantation agriculture. Across the American South, the landscape began to change. After the forced removal of Native American nations through policies such as the Indian Removal Act of 1830, millions of acres of land in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana were open to white settlement. Planters moved rapidly into these regions, purchasing land and building plantations designed for large-scale cotton production. Towns emerged along river systems where cotton could be shipped downstream to ports, like New Orleans, where it would then move outward to international markets. The demand driving this expansion did not come only from within the United States. British textile factories, fueled by the Industrial Revolution, required enormous quantities of raw cotton. American plantations became the primary supplier. By the 1840s and 1850s, cotton produced by enslaved labor in the United States accounted for the majority of the world's supply, feeding industrial textile production. The crop became so dominant that it shaped national trade patterns. Cotton exports generated a huge share of American foreign revenue. Northern shipping firms transported it. Insurance companies insured it. Merchants financed its sale. The wealth created by cotton circulated through banks and commercial networks that stretched far beyond the plantation fields where it was grown. Yet the entire structure rested on labor that was coerced and controlled. Cotton cultivation required an enormous workforce. Fields had to be cleared, planted, weeded, harvested, and processed. Harvest seasons demanded long days of exhausting work under strict supervision. Plantation owners depended on enslaved labor to sustain this production cycle. Without that workforce, the scale of cotton agriculture that developed across the Deep South would have been impossible. This economic demand intensified the internal slave market. As new plantations opened, planters searched for workers to fill them. Traders responded by expanding networks that purchased enslaved people from older states and transported them southward. Auctions in cities such as Richmond and Charleston fed the growing demand in New Orleans, Natchez, and other centers of the cotton frontier. The movement of enslaved people followed the expansion of cotton fields. Traders marched groups south along roads through Tennessee and Alabama. Coastal ships carried enslaved people from ports in the Chesapeake to markets along the Gulf of Mexico. The geography of slavery shifted as labor followed the crop. Inside plantation economies, enslaved people represented not only the workforce producing cotton, but also a form of wealth tied directly to that production. The price of enslaved laborers rose alongside cotton profits. A skilled field hand could command thousands of dollars at auction, an enormous sum in 19th century terms. Investors calculated plantation profitability partly by estimating how much cotton each laborer could produce over a season. In this environment, the value of enslaved people became closely linked to global market conditions. If cotton prices rose, plantation profits increased, and the demand for enslaved labor expanded. If prices fluctuated, the financial pressures rippled through the slave market as well. Human lives were entangled with commodity prices traded across oceans. The result was an economic system in which agricultural production, international trade, and human ownership became inseparable. Cotton wealth fueled plantation expansion. Plantation expansion increased the demand for enslaved workers, and the presence of those workers sustained the cotton economy that tied the American South to global industry. By the middle of the 19th century, observers across the country began describing this relationship with a phrase that captured its political confidence and its economic dependence. Cotton is king. But behind that declaration stood millions of enslaved men, women, and children whose labor powered the empire of cotton that dominated the southern landscape. And as cotton wealth expanded, so did the internal machinery that treated enslaved people not only as workers, but as commodities moving through an organized national market. By the 1830s and 1840s, the buying and selling of enslaved people had developed into a national market with its own geography, its own networks, and its own professional class of traders who moved human beings across the country the same way merchants moved tobacco, grain, or livestock. The system was not hidden. Auctions took place in public squares, advertisements appeared in newspapers, and slave depots operated openly in cities that had become central hubs of the trade. Richmond, Virginia, stood at the northern edge of this market. In the older plantation regions of the Upper South, declining soil productivity and changing agricultural patterns meant that slaveholders often possessed more enslaved laborers than they could profitably employ. At the same time, the Deep South was expanding rapidly. Cotton plantations in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama demanded workers in numbers that local populations alone couldn't supply. Traders built an industry around connecting those two regions. Men such as Isaac Franklin and John Armfield created some of the largest slave trading firms in the country. Their operations purchased enslaved people from slaveholders in Virginia and Maryland, held them temporarily in private jails known as slave pens, and then transported them southward to be sold at markets along the Mississippi River. These were not like small operations. Franklin and Armfield alone handled thousands of enslaved people over the course of their careers. Movement often happened in stages. Groups of enslaved men, women, and children were assembled into coffles, chained lines that could stretch dozens of people long, and marched on foot across hundreds of miles. The journey from Virginia to Mississippi could take weeks. Others were loaded onto coastal ships and transported by sea from the Chesapeake to New Orleans, where some of the largest slave markets in North America operated, and New Orleans became the epicenter of this trade. The city's location near the mouth of the Mississippi River placed it at the heart of the cotton economy. Planters traveled there to purchase laborers for newly established plantations further inland. Auction houses displayed enslaved people in rooms where potential buyers examined them closely, asking questions about age, health, and work experience before bidding began. Advertisements for these sales appeared regularly in Southern newspapers. Notices described men as prime field hands, indicating their suitability for agricultural labor, while women were sometimes described with coded language, such as likely, signaling that they were considered capable of bearing children. The language reduced individuals to economic attributes that buyers could evaluate quickly. Behind the auctions operated a web of finance and credit. Planters rarely paid entirely in cash. Purchases were often financed through credit extended by banks or merchants. Enslaved people themselves could serve as collateral for those loans, meaning that the financial system reinforced the market in human property. Traders relied on this credit network to move large numbers of people through the system while waiting for final payments from buyers. By the mid-19th century, historians estimate that more than 1 million enslaved people had been forcibly relocated within the United States through this domestic trade. Entire communities in the Upper South were gradually drained of population, while the Deep South filled with new arrivals whose labor powered the cotton fields. The economic consequences were enormous. The buying and selling of enslaved people generated profits not only for traders, but also for auctioneers, shipping companies, financiers, and plantation owners who resold individuals at higher prices in expanding markets. Yet within this economic machinery were families whose lives were repeatedly fractured by sale. Parents watched children taken away at auction. Husbands and wives were separated when buyers selected individuals based on labor demand rather than family ties. Letters and testimonies recorded after emancipation describe the constant fear of being sold south, a phrase that came to represent both geographic displacement and the destruction of family bonds. And in the language of the market, these movements appeared as transactions, purchases, sales, transfers between estates. But in lived experience, they were upheavals that reshaped entire lives. The domestic slave trade ensured that the labor supply could follow the expansion of cotton across the South. Yet it also worked alongside another force that continued increasing the size of the enslaved population itself. Birth. Within plantation systems, reproduction quietly expanded the labor force from within, reinforcing the economic structure that traders and planters had already built. Inside plantation ledgers, growth did not only come from the arrival of traders or the purchase of new workers. It also appeared quietly in the margins of account books, recorded in the same careful handwriting that tracked cotton harvests and livestock counts. A small notation beside the name of an enslaved woman might mark the birth of a child. Sometimes the entry was brief, little more than a name and a date. Yet in the financial logic of slavery, that entry represented something more than a family event. It represented the expansion of property. American slave law had long established the principle that determined how this worked. Under the doctrine known as partus sequitur ventrum, a child inherited the legal status of the mother. If the mother was enslaved, the child entered the world enslaved as well. No additional purchase was required. The law itself created the next generation of laborers. This legal rule carried enormous economic implications. Plantation owners did not have to rely entirely on traders to expand their workforce. The system contained its own mechanism for growth. Births increased the number of enslaved people available to work fields, perform domestic labor, or be sold into expanding markets. Plantation managers tracked this growth carefully, overseers recorded the age and physical condition of enslaved laborers, noting when children became old enough to begin light work. Probate inventories compiled after a slaveholder's death often listed infants and young children among the assets of the estate, assigning monetary values based on their projected future labor. These documents reveal how deeply reproduction was integrated into the economics of slavery. For enslaved families, however, the experience existed on a completely different level. Births brought moments of hope and attachment inside communities that struggled to preserve family life under constant threat. Parents raised children while knowing that the legal system did not recognize their authority over them. Slaveholders could sell children at almost any age if financial pressures or market opportunities demanded it. The fear of separation hung over many families. Testimonies recorded after emancipation describe parents worrying not only about survival under forced labor, but also about the possibility that their children could be sold away at any moment. Markets in places like New Orleans and Natchez frequently divided families when buyers selected individuals according to age, strength, or skill rather than family relationships. Yet despite those pressures, enslaved communities formed strong family networks, traditions, and systems of mutual support. Extended kinship ties often stretched across multiple plantations, and families did what they could to maintain bonds in an environment designed to undermine them. Meanwhile, the demographic consequences of the system continued to reshape the United States. By the early 19th century, the enslaved population had already begun to grow naturally. After the 1808 ban on the transatlantic slave trade, that growth accelerated. Census records show a steady increase decade after decade. Children born into slavery eventually became part of the labor force that sustained plantation agriculture, particularly in the cotton-producing states of the Deep South. By 1860, nearly 4 million people were living in slavery in the United States. The majority of them had been born within the country, rather than transported across the Atlantic. This demographic expansion strengthened the economic power of slaveholding regions. It ensured a steady supply of labor for plantations while reinforcing the financial value of enslaved populations held as property. In accounting terms, the system appeared stable, even self-sustaining. But beneath that apparent stability lay a growing contradiction. The same demographic growth that reinforced slavery's economic power also intensified the moral, political, and social conflicts surrounding it. As the population of enslaved people expanded, so too did debates about whether such a system could continue within a nation that increasingly described itself as a republic built on liberty. The numbers in those ledgers, the births, the valuations, the expanding population, were quietly shaping the future of the country. By the middle of the 19th century, the economic structure built around slavery had reached a scale that few earlier generations could have imagined. Cotton plantations covered vast portions of the Deep South. Rivers carried millions of pounds of raw cotton each year toward ports along the Gulf of Mexico. From there, the crop moved across the Atlantic to feed the textile mills of Britain and Europe. The wealth produced by this trade flowed back into the United States through merchants, shipping companies, and banks that financed the movement of goods and credit. At the center of that system stood enslaved labor. By 1860, the United States held nearly 4 million people in bondage. The combined market value of enslaved individuals represented one of the largest concentrations of wealth in the nation. Contemporary estimates placed the total value of enslaved people at billions of dollars in 19th century currency, a figure that exceeded the value of many other categories of property in the country. Plantations were not only agricultural estates, they were repositories of capital measured in human lives. This concentration of wealth shaped national politics in profound ways. Slaveholding elites held enormous influence within southern state governments and within the federal system itself. Representation in Congress was affected by the 3/5 Compromise, which counted a portion of the enslaved population toward political representation while denying those individuals any political rights of their own. As the enslaved population grew, so did the political leverage of the states where slavery dominated the economy. At the same time, opposition to slavery intensified in other parts of the country. Abolitionist movements expanded in the North, publishing newspapers, organizing societies, and speaking publicly about the moral and political contradictions of a nation that proclaimed liberty while maintaining human bondage. Political parties fractured over the issue of whether slavery could expand into new territories opening across the western frontier. Every new territory raised the same question: would slavery be permitted there, or would it be excluded? Compromises attempted to contain the conflict. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 drew a line across the Louisiana Territory. The Compromise of 1850 attempted another fragile balance. Yet, each solution proved temporary. The deeper problem was structural. Slavery had become too central to the Southern economy and too deeply contested in the national conscience to remain politically stable. Behind these debates lay the economic reality created over decades. The domestic slave trade had redistributed labor across the South. Plantation systems had integrated reproduction into their growth. Financial institutions had tied credit and investment to the ownership of enslaved people. The cotton economy had connected Southern agriculture directly to global markets. All of these forces combined to produce a system that was both immensely profitable and increasingly volatile. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, it was the culmination of tensions that had been building for generations. The conflict would ultimately destroy the legal framework that had allowed slavery to function as an economic institution. With the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865, slavery was formally abolished in the United States. Yet the legacy of that economic system did not vanish with a single law. The wealth generated by enslaved labor had shaped land ownership, financial networks, and regional development across the country. The social and political consequences would continue unfolding long after emancipation. Looking back, the hidden economy of American slavery reveals a structure that extended far beyond the plantation fields themselves. It linked law, finance, agriculture, and international trade into a system that converted human lives into measurable assets within a national balance sheet. And for decades, that system grew quietly, line by line in plantation ledgers, until its contradictions became impossible for the nation to contain.